Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the regularly scheduled meeting of the Ways and Means Committee. I'm John Quincy, Chair, joined by Council Members Yang, Bender, and Johnson. And I don't think Council Vice President Glidden will be joining us for today. She has another engagement that she's working on. And we also are joined here by Council Member Jacob Fry, who is not on this committee, but eager to talk about one of the items, I'm sure. So we'll get to that. Let's begin with the public hearing. This is a public hearing that was referred to this committee from the City Council meeting of March 18th. This is related to severance pay for appointed employees ordinance. Mr. Bloom from our City Attorney's Office. You could run through this really quickly. Also joined by Councilmember Palmisano. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Mike Bloom. I'm an attorney with the City Attorney's Office. I'm here today on behalf of Spencer Cronick, who has a commitment elsewhere. You have in front of you an amendment to Chapter 20 relating to administration and personnel, specifically the city severance ordinance. And we're here today to ask you to make certain amendments to that severance ordinance. The first thing we're asking you to do is to review the ordinance as it relates to defining which actual employees are entitled to severance under the ordinance. And the amendments as presented define those appointed employees who are eligible to receive severance as department heads who are nominated by the mayor, recommended by the executive committee, and appointed by city council. The amendments also will bring our city ordinance in conformity with state law, which limits severance to 6 months. And then the final thing that this proposed ordinance does is to delete certain language in the ordinance that currently exists that actually sunset last February 28th, 2010. So we're just going to be eliminating that language entirely from the ordinance. So staff recommends today passage of the ordinance and that you then move this matter forward to council for approval.
Great. Thank you very much. Council members, are there any questions for Mr. Bloom on the content of this? Not seeing any. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Bloom. I'll just open the public hearing. Anybody here to speak on this? Anyone? Anyone? Not seeing any. I'll close the public hearing and move adoption of this item. Any further questions? Not seeing any. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. And opposed? There aren't any. So those items will go forward for Friday. Next, we have a consent agenda of about 25 items, 24 additional items. I'll just read those through really quickly. Legal settlements. There are 3 legal settlements. Item number 5 is the agreement with the Restorative Justice Community Action, Restorative Justice Services. We have a bid from the convention center from Verascon for West Entrance Landscape Project, a bid by Brindle Painting for painting in the exhibit halls, a bid for Gunner Electric for Target Center sports lighting upgrade. This item is not related to the redo of the Target Center. This is ongoing operations that was already in that project. For that, Community Planning and Economic Development has something forwarded to us from the Downtown East Commons Operations and Funding and Gift Acceptance. And I'm assuming we're going to be able to pull that for a brief discussion on that. So we'll move on to the IT department, who has a contract amendment with Digital Health Department for software and support. Contract amendment with DIRAD for interactive voice response system. Item number 12 is the contract amendment with Competitive Edge software for online incident reporting services. 13, contract amendment with Bezotech for Site Studio 11G project work. Regulatory Services brings forward a bid for Wilson Custom Tree for landscape maintenance. Referred from the Community Development and Regulatory Services Committee comes a contract for Hennepin County to receive funds to manage industry-specific and geographically targeted job fairs in 2016. Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee brings forward several items, including grant acceptance for Minnesota Department of Health for Family Home Visiting Services, operating expense donation acceptance from Friends of the Skyway Senior Center. From Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management, we have the mutual aid agreement with the City of Duluth for Minneapolis Mounted Patrol Services during the 2016 Grandma's Marathon. We have a contract with Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority and/or SMG for bomb detection and 9/11 dispatch services at US Bank Stadium for 25 large-scale events in 2016. Contract with Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority for SWAT officers at US Bank for large-scale events. We also, from the Transportation and Public Works Committee, we have the Washington Avenue Reconstruction Streetscape Project. We have a contract amendment with In Control Inc. for dewatering plant software charges. And contract amendment with Kale America for on-street parking system. Contract amendment with Conurbation for Nicollet Mall project management. Sorry, I mispronounced that. And then a bid for 26th Avenue reconstruction project. Any questions on any of those items, except for item number 9 that we'll be pulling for some quick presentation. On all those other consent items, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Those items carry. And Miles Mercer, if you could join us, we'll have some questions on item number 9, which relates to the Downtown East and the DID Commons project. Just general kind of overview would be great, and would be able to answer any additional questions.
Sure, happy to do that. Good afternoon, I'm Miles Mercer with the city's Department of Community Planning and Economic Development. Today we're here to seek your approval for 5 items related to the operations of the Downtown East Commons. There's been a lot of progress on the project related to design, construction, and fundraising. Our community is going to have a new public space that is more than just a flat, grassy field. The first phase of improvements is under construction and will be done this summer, and the Commons will open for use. Today's actions continues the progress by establishing an approach to the operations. The actions are before you, and they include authorizing an agreement with the Minneapolis Downtown Improvement District for up to $600,000 to operate the Commons on an interim basis for the remainder of this year. Second, to authorize waiving a request for proposals for the agreement with the DID and for any agreements between DID and its professional service providers. But DID shall otherwise comply with city contracting ordinances. Third, authorizing staff to negotiate and return to City Council with the terms of an agreement with Green Minneapolis to operate the Commons on the longer term and waiving a request for proposals. Fourth, passage of a resolution amending the 2016 General Appropriation Resolution to allocate $250,000 from the city's Capital Improvement Fund for the Commons to the General Fund to contribute to Commons operations in 2016. And fifth, passage of a resolution for the acceptance of additional charitable gifts from Green Minneapolis for the construction and operation of the Commons. In short, these actions allow us to do the following. The city will contract with the DID in the near term to operate the Commons. This contract would be separate and separately funded from the DID's role as a special services district. DID would perform the operational services of the Commons at cost and not charge a management fee. DID is uniquely positioned to play this operational role in the near term, given its existing operational presence downtown, serving similar sorts of functions. Contracting with DID in the near term gives the city more time to seek a longer-term operating agreement with Green Minneapolis. Green Minneapolis is a nonprofit parks conservancy created to support greening downtown and is managing the fundraising for the Commons. Funding for operations in 2016 would come from the city and the operational funds raised as part of the philanthropic fundraising campaign. The city's 2016 adopted budget included one-time funding of $250,000 for the Commons project. At that time, a potential use contemplated for the funds was improvements to the adjacent right-of-way. At this time, sufficient funding is available for those capital costs. Therefore, we request that these funds be reallocated for operational use in the Commons this year. Based on the operating models of other comparable public spaces around the country, a base financial contribution from the local municipality has been a critical component of operating revenue. The balance of funding for 2016 would come from the operating funding held by Green Minneapolis that is being raised as part of the philanthropic campaign for the Commons. These actions before you today are time sensitive given the approaching opening of the space this summer, and staff recommends approval.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Mercer. And I'm sure we'll have a couple of questions. This is just about the 2016 portion. This doesn't address the 2017 and ongoing budget implications, which will be part of that conversation, I'm sure. And what happens to the $600,000 that you mentioned earlier? That's a DID estimate. If it falls short of that, what happens to the excess revenues for that? Will that be rolled over into the next year's operating issues, or if there's a shortfall, how will that gap be covered?
Mr. Chair, the contract with DID would be not to exceed $600,000, but I think you're asking for in the situation where it's less than the actual costs are less than that, those funds would go into and remain in the operating account for the Commons. And so they would not need as much money to draw as much money from the operating reserve for those costs, and thus conserving those funds for future operating costs.
Gotcha. And just wanted to be clear, this is not a new appropriation request or an additional item. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, that's my understanding.
Okay.
I defer to Finance for confirmation.
Okay. Well, we'll see if there's any additional questions, but if Ms. Christensen, if you'd like to add anything to the finance component of this.
Chair Quincy, members of the committee, the $250,000 as part of the requested action is already included in the council adopted budget for 2016. Right. The request before you today is merely to reallocate it from one area to another area.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Councilmember Bender, followed by Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, first I would say thanks to the Downtown Council and the Downtown Improvement District for jumping in here. I think it speaks to the good relationship that we all have that was able to happen. I wondered, so I have several questions. One is about the anticipated capital costs for which we originally allocated the $250,000. Are those no longer needed, or how, what was that money supposed to be for, and what's happening now with the capital side of things?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, question about what was the initial intent for that $250,000. I am not privy to all the intent behind those, about how those got into the city budget, but if you look at in the budget where it was in the Public Works' Transportation, Maintenance, and Repair section. So what's happening out there is, in addition to improvements to the Commons itself, and think of the Commons as sort of the property, all the insides, there's the adjacent right-of-way. Right? There's the sidewalks, there's the curb and gutters, there's street lights. As part of a broader public works plan to change and augment the pedestrian realm in this part of town, the city has been implementing changes to make wider sidewalks, to make bump outs at intersections and things like this around as new construction is occurring in that area. And that's, for example, been happening around the new Wells Fargo blocks. So since the construction is occurring in the Commons, this is an opportunity to also change that public right-of-way. To make it for wider sidewalks. We're shrinking the width of Portland Avenue, making an off-street bike lane along Portland Avenue. So those are city costs because they are improving the public right-of-way. And so at this point, there's enough funding for those costs in the public right-of-way. And I would defer to the Director of Public Works if there's anything else to add on that point, but I think that's what it is.
Councilmember Bender, did you need any further clarification? Or?
I guess that's okay. I mean, I guess one question I would have then would we anticipate those capital costs to be seen like next year or in future years, or you've covered it through other capital funding sources?
Mr. Kotke, if you could help clarify that, that'd be terrific.
Yes, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender. So the dollars that we are using for what I call the street improvements, the right-of-way improvements in and around the Commons, but also along the Wells Fargo's buildings are part of the Development Infrastructure Program, so DIP dollars. I think maybe a little bit of the confusion of what happened here is while the cost of those improvements were still being identified and worked out, Last year during the budget process, they put in additional $250,000 thinking that we would not have enough dollars to make those improvements. As it turns out, we did have adequate dollars in the DIP program to make the improvements around both the Wells Fargo's development as well as the Commons.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank-
That's great. And then I had more questions about the operations part. So it's opening in June, July?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Member, I would say this summer.
Okay. So we have so with $600,000, that maybe is approximately $100,000 a month of operating costs. So my question was, could you talk more about what that covers? It seems like probably more than mowing the lawn. And then my next question will be about going forward and what we would anticipate in future years.
Sure. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Member, and I'll just say for the reason for my saying this summer is because we're still very dependent upon the weather in terms of how construction is unfolding on there. So I feel uncomfortable giving a specific date about opening. But in terms of the operating budget, in the term sheet that was an exhibit to the RCA, at the end of that term sheet is a breakdown of the estimated operating budget. So the line items include on-site staff costs, landscape maintenance, snow removal, utilities, supplies and equipment, park management and event coordination, general management overhead. But basically what that means is DID would have a presence, and it wouldn't be your typical DID branded ambassadors out there. They're probably going to be wearing a different sort of uniform because this is separate from the DID, but it's having a presence. It's answering questions for visitors. It's doing general cleaning. It's doing some basic maintenance. Some basic management of the space in terms of keeping folks off the turf, for example, after a big rain, snow removal in the summer. DID does plan to do some activation of the space. So the space will already be programmed for example, some events at the stadium. And so there's someone that needs to coordinate those events. But I'd say the DID also plans to do some level, probably a base level of proactive programming within the space. So all those sorts of activities is what is embedded in that $600,000 budget.
And then the last question is just about going forward, how we anticipate being able to cover what's a pretty significant amount of operating cost for the space. And would you anticipate it being the same breakdown of what it's about 40% city? And then what are the plans? I mean, I think it was very thoughtful for Green Minneapolis to set aside a portion of the capital fundraising dollars for operations, but knowing that at some point, that capital fundraising program will be done, and then what would be the plan then to try to, fundraise or fill that other percentage? So I guess the questions are we making, do we anticipate being making a several $100,000 ongoing commitment of city funds for operations? And then where will the rest of the money come from?
Right. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Member, great questions. Looking forward, I would anticipate, and I think in the staff report anticipates that there would need to be an ongoing city contribution to the operations of Commons, but we acknowledge that would be worked out and subject to approval as part of the city's 2017 budget process. If you look back on some of the studies that our consultant team did around the Commons, and this was reported out to you in a prior staff report in response to a staff direction from the City Council about thinking about operating funding. There's really a couple different buckets that operating revenue comes from when you look at comparable types of spaces across the country. One bucket, as I already mentioned, is some sort of contribution from the local municipality. Another bucket can be ongoing fundraising, and I would hope that Green Minneapolis would able to do that, not only successfully completing its upfront capital campaign, but also on an ongoing basis look for charitable contributions to help support the operations in the park. A third bucket would be operating revenue, earned revenue. So to the extent that there are concessions or event rental fees, or if someday there is a permanent building with a restaurant, fees from that, potentially fees for sponsoring different programming and events in the space. That would be another category, operating revenue, earned revenue in. And then a fourth category that our consultants talk about is sort of value capture mechanisms, that often with these sorts of public spaces, there's either some sort of property tax capture district or a sales tax capture district. We don't necessarily have all those tools within our statutory framework, but I think that's something that we've investigated and could be part of the mix going forward. So I'd say right now we know what the plan is for 2016, and there's a lot to figure out for 2017 in terms of what is the right size budget given what we think are going to be the likely revenue sources, and this will be an ongoing formula and deliberation that we figure out each year as we go forward.
Thank you. Anything else, Councilmember? Okay, Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pretty excited to see the downtown park coming together. So it's great to see the trees coming in. I can't wait till it opens. I look forward to using it. My question would be for Ms. Christensen around precedent of using capital improvement dollars for operations if there's no longer the need there. Is there a precedent around that? I guess the one part where I have some hesitation here too is that there's a lot of need, obviously enough that we just approved a historic deal the other week. There's a lot of capital improvement need within our city, and I can think of a lot of uses, both in my own ward, but also downtown, around downtown East, where $250,000 could be well used for infrastructure for the public.
Chair Quincy, Councilmember Johnson, the $250,000 in question, while it was housed within the capital improvement area of the 2016 adopted budget, it's a little bit different than what we would have categorized as quote unquote capital funding. The $250,000 was actually provided through the general fund balance. It was using money that was previously in the fund balance. It wasn't specifically levied or budgeted for in a prior year for capital improvements. So largely because of its nature as originating in the general fund, it could be used for pretty much anything.
That's helpful. Are there other projects that we've done that for also in this particular budget that have originated from the general fund leftover?
Chair Quincy, Councilmember Johnson, some of the other items, as I recall, a little bit vaguely from the budget process, included funding in the past couple of years for the Upper Harbor Terminal and some preliminary work done in that area. That is the one that comes specifically to mind, as well as the city's development infrastructure program was funded with $500,000 of general fund resources as opposed to issuing net debt bonds. So in those times in which there are sufficient funds available from the general fund, when we exceed our minimum fund balance, there is opportunity to utilize those resources. But again, from a standpoint of their restricted nature, they're not restricted as are other resources that are dedicated for capital.
All right, thank you. That's very helpful. And I think that hearing that makes me more comfortable with this, but I still probably today will abstain on this one specifically because the DIP funding is something I've actually been looking for replenishment of, to see more money going into it. There's opportunities out there to even leverage something as small as $250,000 to pair it up with a development opportunity and ultimately secure a $30 million or $50 million project where we're investing in the public infrastructure around it. And so I'd like to have a little more time to chat with staff about the direction that's heading in terms of where we see that fund balance and additional allocations before making a decision on Friday. Thank you.
Go ahead, Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wondered also if you could update us a bit on how we're doing with making sure there's public access to this space. And I'm hearing Councilmember Fry wanted to chime in, but if you had
I'll call on
any
Councilmember
kind of
Fry when I want
update
to.
about the negotiations around the use agreements or the setting up and taking down of game day facilities or anything like that would be helpful.
Sure. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, in terms of the space being publicly available, I would say that the space will always be publicly available. It is a public space. There will be times where some events in the stadium have use rights in the park, and those use rights may involve some restricted access areas if they're serving alcohol or something like that. But otherwise, the space is available even for those events that are happening in conjunction with the stadium. But one piece of news, and I would defer to Councilmember Fry to talk more about this, but in terms of updates on the plan of the Minnesota Vikings in particular. One thing that has happened since we initially negotiated this deal is that the Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority got access through a lease to property owned by Hennepin County. It's the parking lot of the medical examiner's building. And having the Sports Facilities Authority getting access to that lot, not to mention some vacated right-of-way on Fifth Street and the balance of the plaza on the Downtown East Light Rail Station block, that if you're out there, if you've been out there, you'll see that MSFA is also completing construction out there to build a hardscape plaza. And what the Vikings have said in writing is that their plan is to install most of the, if not all, of the permanent facilities such as tents or other things that they may need to take down or set up if it was in the commons. They'll place them there because they can be more permanently erected there and stay there, which would then reduce their need to set those sort of facilities up in the commons itself. And they've talked about in the commons, they may have a focus more on family-friendly activities, throwing a ball competitions or 50-yard dash or other things like that.
Good. Well, thank you. Are there any other questions for Mr. Mercer? Not seeing any. Would be happy to, Councilmember Fry, if you'd like to add some general comments before we take up this item.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mercer, for a whole lot of work that has been undertaken in order to get to this point. A couple things that I will perhaps reiterate, perhaps elaborate on for the first time. First is regarding the public accessibility of this space. This space, although it's taken a lot of work to sort of push back the use agreement a little bit, we've gotten there. And it will be a 100% publicly accessible space every single day, including Vikings game days. So I just want to say that again so everybody's really, really clear on this. It's a space that is 100% publicly accessible on every single day, including Vikings game days. So in other words, it can't be roped off. You can't charge a fee. The Vikings can't require a ticket to be shown in order to get in. Literally anybody can participate. Now, the Vikings and the MSFA do have rights to certain days. I want to be clear. They have rights to certain days, but even on those certain days, it has to be publicly accessible. And in my mind, a lot of those rights results in a good thing. It results in free programming of the space. If the Vikings want to have a punting contest for kids, or if they want to do NFL 360 out there and literally anybody can participate, I'm all for it. That equals traffic in the park and activation, and that's good. That's period of the day, periods of the week that we don't need to pay for the programming. But every single other day, again, 100% publicly accessible for both MSFA and the Vikings. And if you look at some of the events that they have planned and what they're talking about doing, this is like a good thing. I think for a while people have been talking about it being a bad thing when other entities have rights. It actually, I think, results in a positive the vast majority of the time. So second thing we're talking about in terms of this particular request for council action is money. First off, the $600,000 that was allocated to the DID, this is money that, for the most part, has been privately raised by Green Minneapolis, has gone into a reserve, and then Green Minneapolis is paying out that money, so it doesn't result in any incremental additional cost for us. We've gone to bat trying to get as many private donations as possible, and I think at this point in time we're actually doing very well. We're not quite there yet in terms of the total dollar figure, but we're well on track. In terms of the money that's allocated, or I should say reallocated from a public works improvement to a park operation, I can tell you that not only has it already been allocated, one, so there's no additional allocation, but two, this was like the bare minimum. I think several of us that have been working on this actually thought that we should have a greater amount allocated, and I was one of them. But this is the bare minimum that we're talking to in order to have a park that functions well for the space. And then finally, in talking about the long-term operations and maintenance, Mr. Mercer covered most of the specifics. There likely will need to be an ongoing city contribution, but we do have several partners in the deal. The use agreement as it sits requires that entities like the MSFA need to retain the commons after every single use to pristine condition. So they pay for that. Pristine condition after MSFA use, and it's on their dime. So in other words, they can replace the sod, they can mow the grass, they can make sure that the commons is back in an adequate state to prepare for the next event. So, you know, I would love your support on this item. I do feel like this is a point of success because we've got for the interim period, the DID to take care of things, and that allows us to work out a contract that functions well for our city for the long term with Green Minneapolis. If we were to just approve something right now with Green Minneapolis, you probably wouldn't like it as much. It would not be a favorable contract. This allows us the time to get something in place that functions well.
Well, thank you very much, Councilmember Fry, not only for helping clarify this topic and your summary of that, but also for all of your work on bringing this item forward as a member of that steering committee with Green Minneapolis and DID. Thank you, Mr. Mercer and Mr. Lutz and everybody who's been involved in putting this proposal together. I think it does move us forward to taking action on this during this summer as it opens. Mr. Kramer, thank you very much for you and for Downtown Council and DID's support of what we're trying to accomplish here. Rather than splitting up, separating items, because we're doing an agreement with DID, we're doing a waiver for an RFP, authorizing staff to negotiate terms of an agreement, accepting a charitable gift resolution, as well as the allocation of the $250 from one appropriation to the another within the general fund. I think I'd like to move this entire item forward to the council for Friday without any specific recommendation out of this committee, so we can have a few days to digest all of the components of it rather than separate it individually here today. So if that's okay with committee members, all those in favor of moving forward without recommendation this item? I have questions. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that approach. I think we're kind of trying to do the short and long term together here, and I think we're getting pretty close to the point where a number of us may feel uncomfortable continuing to make these short-term commitments without understanding the years-long commitment that it's really going to take to make sure that this is successful, and understanding where those funding sources are going to come from. Looking at what's probably about a $1.2 million annual operating budget. And when you compare that to the $3 million extra dollars we just gave for all of our neighborhood parks across the city, just kind of putting that into that context, it is a pretty significant commitment. And I think that policymakers will feel more comfortable with a higher level of certainty about where we imagine that funding will be able to come from in years 3, 4, and 5, for example. So I appreciate that approach and the opportunity to take a little more time over the next week or so to get some more information about that.
Thank you for that. Councilmember Fry, a comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just briefly, and I'll get my colleagues some additional documentations on these facts that I'm about to explain, but the amount of annual tax revenue that this area has generated as a result of this park, separate from the stadium, far exceeds any allocation that we would ever dream of in a million years allocating. I mean, we're talking about, I wish I knew the exact figure offhand, but it's tens and tens of millions of dollars that we're getting on an annual basis from this area. So the end net benefits to the rest of the city in terms of property taxes into the general fund far exceeds, not even remotely close, the amount of money that we'll ultimately put into the commons.
Yes, and I'm a big supporter of all of those efforts to do that. Obviously, I have been. But there was also no tax increment financing used in this deal. And we still haven't even figured out how we're going to make money as we will with all the additional parking revenues from downtown. So there's a lot of revenue sources coming into the city with this investment. But we got to figure it out, and we got to be planful into the future how we're going to afford to operate this in competition with all our other demands for resources. So thank you again for staff. Thank you for those comments. And any other questions on the comments on the motion to send forward out recommendation? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? That item is sent forward. And with nothing further on the agenda, we are adjourned. Thank you.